Those are all the forms I had. Members, what's your pleasure? What do you want to do?
Option 4.
Option 4.
I kind of like Joe's hybrid because it gives us the idea and then the goal, and then we can figure it out later. I am sort of inclined to think we shouldn't be trying to duplicate what the boards do because that's so incredibly complicated.
Mr. Chair, I have a second before you discuss it more.
Oh, sure.
I have some questions.
Sure, of course.
Can Joe address some of June's concern? I mean, I heard her say there were no gaps out there, and of course I've heard others say that there are. Can that be addressed?
They can. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm nervous about going with the full policy, because I'm not sure that that we have identified the gaps in ways that I'm as comfortable with regulating, because what we're doing is developing a regulation. So I'll give another example in a different chapter. In the Water Resources chapter, we essentially require that people use and implement urban water management plans. We have some experience there, and we know that about 1/3 of urban agencies that are legally required to do it don't do it. So, it's a 20-year history. So we can say this is clearly an area where we ought to add our weight and try and regulate there. I am not as sure that in the Delta there are identified gaps where this regulation is necessary. But one of the reasons for proposing the hybrid is I'm trying to be helpful here. And Randy doesn't think it's helpful, but is to help us identify the areas where there may be gaps. So if you actually say everybody that does a project should identify if there are significant negative water quality impacts, then you at least provide the basis for having information that you can use in the future. I'm not even sure that requires a policy because, as I said, it's actually the law now as part of CEQA.
Thank you. My other thought was, is whether it's a policy or recommendation, is it helpful to us meeting the Delta plan as it relates to the language that says we have to do whatever regarding water quality? The state board certainly has the authority to do that. So would a policy or recommendation be helpful? I heard also June say that there were some issues with the process already in terms of getting permits and so forth.
Oh, they're huge issues.
So I guess my question would be, is this helpful? I mean, why are we considering this whole issue of putting something in the plan as it relates to water quality? Would it be helpful to the plan meeting the COECO goals or satisfying the language or the authority of the plan or the council? Why are we, I guess, going back to what Mr. Zuckerman said, it's kind of confusing, at least for me, as to what the real intent is for this. What's the intent?
I think the intent is to, if we go with the hybrid that I proposed, is to gather information and to affirm that our objective is, as is stated in the law, to meet the beneficial uses. So I agree that alternative 4, I like that language. I like having a sub-goal there. I think that's a good thing to do.
Recommendation rather than a policy.
Well, it actually does more than a recommendation. It says specifically what our objective is, and that therefore it does become something that you can use when you're doing reviews of EIRs. It's useful that way.
Option 4.
Option 4 does do that.
Let me note the phrase sub-goal. I know a lot about the phrase sub-goal because for reasons we never could understand, we used it in the Dell division process. And that's because when we started to list our recommendations, somebody decided to go from a number 1 to an A, B, C, and then to a subset of that.
That's where it came from.
There is no, but we never talked about sub-goals. Well, we included it in our little plan, and it got picked up in the statute. It is not without note that if we do a sub-goal, it is the only time in this Delta plan that sub-goal will be referred to. So I don't recommend you do it because it's too bloody confusing. It's either goal, well, the question is, does it have regulatory impact or not? That seems to me that's the question. It doesn't matter, a sub-goal doesn't define itself, it's how we define it. So if you're going to do it, the choice is between something that is not regulatory or something that is, in my judgment, and that's cleaner. Can I ask a question of all you guys? I think I'm correct that neither the urban or agricultural water management plans specifically require the entities to plan for maximum possible water quality.
That's actually true. They do have to respond if they have a violation.
Well, that's, yeah, if there's a violation, regulatory action pending or concluded.
If they're monitoring so there's a violation of a water quality objective, they do have to show that they're taking actions to respond to that. But they don't actually have to meet those objectives. Those objectives are not part of their permit.
Okay.
That's true in stormwater discharges too.
Now, there are basin water quality plans, and I do not precisely know, I don't know enough about them to tell whether that planning document is the equivalent of an urban or an agricultural water management plan.
I'm not quite sure what you're talking about.
I'm looking for basin water quality
The basin
plans.
plans?
Yeah.
The basin plans are basically the regulatory requirements for water quality. They set the beneficial uses, they set where they're applied,
And they are, the basin plans are developed, of course, by the basins themselves.
by the regional water board.
Okay.
If that's the basin plans you're talking about. Those are actually the water quality regulations for that particular region. And so they include all of the water quality objectives, all these standards are in those basin plans.
Well, if, under your staff language, they may be demonstrated by compliance with applicable regional and state water quality plans and policies, waste discharge requirements, and waiver conditions. Does that include the basin plans on water quality?
Yes, it would.
So an entity in compliance with the basin plans, prima facie, would probably satisfy this language?
The way it's written, that's correct.
Joe?
That's correct. Absolutely.
But I thought you said, which is the approach we've taken with the conservation requirements and water system efficiency requirements elsewhere in the Delta Plan.
Be consistent with the law, yes.
Then why don't we want to do this? If there's a plan out there they must conform with now anyway.
I think the language in this is a little bit different than we used in those policies, and but conceptually,
I mean, I like Felicia's point of referring to plans that exist that impose a condition or requirement or obligation or duty. And I thought the notion that actually folks coming in and actually having to demonstrate they're achieving their own plans makes a lot of sense, or plans they're required to live with. But we've been talking
I think we add in this, we have language that says that people have to shall avoid or mitigate those impacts to the maximum extent practicable. And then we have the language that says you can meet this by complying with the basin plan objectives. So this is different because it has that
to the
requirement.
maximum extent practical.
Yes.
Okay. Randy.
Oh, I was just going to say, to answer your question, I think the problem I have is that we're talking about a policy to regulate a regulation. And I'm not a big fan of doing something like that. I think we need to be very clear that we favor good water quality. That needs to come out loud and strong in the water quality chapter. And if I were to recommend anything in regards to taking further action, it would be to put on the to be determined or to be monitored list this issue of a concern about stormwater discharge and stormwater quality, and put that as a future issue.
Yes, Hank.
Well, it seems to me that water quality is implicit in our co-equal goals, both for the environment and for human use. I don't like the idea of a sub-goal. That seems like it kind of minimizes it and reduces it. I don't like taking on something that other agencies are supposed to regulate. So I think it's fine just to acknowledge, that this is important in what we're doing and is in the purview of other agencies, but not take it on ourselves.
Felicia, sorry.
What I heard from staff, again, here's where I'm torn. Duplication's not a great thing. It's a very complex area. But I've heard, for the time I've been here, people talking about how important water quality is, and from water users across the board. So I don't want to just ignore it or assume anything. And then I heard you all talking about the recommendation about the special water quality protection for those special ecosystem restoration areas. That's a different issue and something that is tied in with what we're recommending about other aspects where people don't interfere with that capacity. I'm not sure where that goes in this. Everybody makes sense in this conversation, but I'm trying to figure out where is the added value, lightest touch thing we can do that acknowledges the water quality issues of importance and does acknowledge the fact that we are recommending that there are going to be special areas that have to be considered, as part of it, rewriting in a way that recommends to the state board or the regional boards what they ought to be doing, and then having us monitor it later to see if we need more hooks. I don't know. I'm just always trying to figure out what's the lightest touch thing we can do that actually will make good on what we're saying ought to happen.
I don't know. We're going to be taking. Pat, I'm sorry.
Following what Felicia said, should we consider making a recommendation to the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board to do what we say in option 2? Dan suggested that Contra Costa has a higher standard. If the issue is within the Central Valley Regional Board and looking at stormwater issues that may negatively impact some of these restoration areas, couldn't we draw attention to that for the regional board as well as for the state board and do it as a recommendation?
I want to ask staff, is that, in fact, is the issue the Central Valley Board, or is the issue both the Bay Board and the Central Valley Board, or is it neither board, it's just that nobody has paid attention to that issue?
I think it's probably the latter. I just think that they have different approaches to regulating stormwater,
And they haven't thought about its impact on ecosystem restoration over the long term in the Delta?
I don't think that's been on their radar screen. I think if we did ask them to come up with, if we recommended them to develop an approach to, better water quality protection for ecosystem, that might be a reasonable thing to do.
Again, I'm a little bit leery of using the term of art that we use on the coast because
Right.
it's a different. So I like the language you just used, develop an approach, because it acknowledges what we have here are what Supervisor Natoli pointed out is not areas of special concern, at least not yet. What we have is opportunity areas, and some of them will become areas of special concern when we actually implement the ecosystem restoration. But you certainly wouldn't want to say you need to impose these regulations or you even consider imposing them on this entire area based on something that is not going to happen for another 40 years, and certainly wouldn't even ever under anybody's plan include all of the land that's shown on that map.
Let me just throw a suggestion to trying to piece this together. The first paragraph of the proposed staff draft on water quality in the Delta, I'd suggest to you, has not received much commotion. You may have an objection, don't do any regulation. You know, Randy's point, there's another agency out there, we don't need it. However, the reality is this language on maximum extent practicable has raised questions. Here's a suggestion for you that blends a couple of these. Keep a policy with the first paragraph. Delete from the second paragraph the maximum extent practicable stuff. So the second paragraph would be proposed action shall identify any significant negative water quality impacts and shall avoid or mitigate these impacts. I think comma, Joe, you said period, but I'd say comma, by compliance with applicable regional and state water quality plans, blah, blah, blah. Number two, as a recommendation, this is Pat's point on this recommendation for special water quality protections for the Delta, the thing you were talking about. Let's make that a recommendation to the Water Board. Now, I'm not sure that does everything what you want, but it takes a significant argument about the level out of what is our policy, but it retains a policy statement on what is one of the inherent objectives of the Delta Plan according to the legislature, which I think is important, and it makes a recommendation to the State Water Board for special areas, special conditions, whatever the language. Yeah, that's my suggestion. Randy.
Well, that's along the lines of what Joe offered up earlier. I would accept both as recommendations, but I think we're trying to regulate a regulation with a policy, and I just don't think that's necessary.
We can present whatever we want by motions now and start doing it, or do you want to take a late lunch break now, have the staff conspire with itself and make a recommendation to us based on this conversation? First thing we come back.
I'll move for lunch.
The more appropriate motion is we're going to ask Mr. Ray and Mr. Grindstaff and staff to digest this, come back to us with your suggestions after lunch. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm told by our staff there's no such thing as an easily available lunch. I noted that Squeeze In is a half block away from here, so if you like giant hamburgers with grilled cheese dripping off the side, I promise not to tell any of your cardiologists, but it's quite close. All right? Okay, it's 10 minutes after 1. We're going to start at 10 minutes after 2.
I guess not.